Architecton is a movie I really wish I liked more. It's a movie that's definitely very niche. It's 100 minutes of a documentary with very little dialogue and mostly just a bunch of very slow moving, slow developing imagery about stone and concrete. Obviously, from that very premise, there's a lot of people who would just dislike it straight off the bat. But I'm not one of those people. I went to see this movie because it sounded like something I would like. However, I have quite a few gripes about the movie, most of it stemming from the last 5 minutes. So, spoilers, I guess. I don't hate this movie, but there's just some things about it that really grind my gears. There's very little dialogue, so obviously we should focus on what's said when there is some dialogue. The last 5 minutes feature a character, an architect, talking to another man about how he doesn't like concrete as a construction material. With that context, and that being a really just statement of the theme of the movie, I have to ask why a lot of decisions were made. The thing is, I don't even disagree with this conclusion. I also think that concrete is a pretty crappy construction material that is poorly used in current architecture. I work in architecture, I've studied architecture history, I have a lot of opinions about this. If the movie had cut out these last 5 minutes, I would have said, oh, it's an interesting art piece presenting an argument. But when you then have someone directly state the argument, it not only feels cheaper, like you didn't expect the audience to be able to understand what you were putting down, but also it just, having two old men talk about this makes it come off like an old man yelling at a cloud about things he doesn't like in this darn modern day. But as I said, I'm actually interested in what this movie is trying to open a dialogue about, so let's discuss some of this dialogue. By far the most compelling idea of this movie is that concrete is sort of a lifeless, dry material that isn't really good for anything and just turns into a crappy mess pretty quickly. Throughout the movie we have stone, we have a stone quarry, we have the walls of the quarry being blasted apart to mine more stone, and we have that stone. We follow that stone through the industrial process of it being broken apart and turned into concrete, and then we see all these concrete buildings stretching out for miles and miles, tightly packed into a modern city with just multi-story concrete apartment buildings everywhere you look. To contrast to that, we have an old stone Roman ruin right in the middle of this city where there's archaeology work being done. And it's just like, yeah, there's a pretty big contrast between the monumental ruin of stone versus all these concrete apartments surrounding it. Then to tie this all together, we have cool shots of stone being taken by train through a harsh, arid desert. +1 for me because it's cool train footage. I like trains. But this part's definitely building on the idea of concrete as sort of a dry, arid expanse. Contrast that to many of the scenes we see with stone, showing water or precipitation or more natural ideas. Then we get to a bunch of crappy concrete buildings being torn down, there's rubble shoved into trucks and taken to a dump. And then pretty much near the end of the movie we have this shot, this long sequence that ends with this shot that really pulls the whole thesis together of we have this dump of just all this construction rubble from these destroyed buildings. And it's within eye shot. It's half a mile away from the quarry that this stone came from in the first place. We've done all this work, all this effort, and what have we made? We've made garbage. Literal garbage. And as far as presentation goes, yes, if that was just the movie there and cut out the last 5 minutes where we're told in dialogue that that's what the movie's about, interesting art argument. Also wrong, because there's just some other shots in the movie that seem to contradict its own message, and maybe that's the point, but if the point was to provide a bunch of different messages, you literally gave one a voice and the others you didn't. At one point we see a ruin of a sort of incomplete concrete building that's just sort of sitting there empty. It's the one on some of the posters for the film. However, was that supposed to be shown as lifeless, or was it supposed to be shown as cool? Because it was presented in much the same methods that was shown to present a bunch of old stone ruins. The real kicker that muddies the message and makes me question what the heck they were thinking with this film is that the very opening of the film shows a bunch of destroyed concrete apartment buildings in Ukraine. The movie never identifies by name any locations. There's no like title cards of this is here where we are. But the opening shots were absolutely definitely in Ukraine. There's Ukraine flags hanging from the destroyed buildings. There's anti-Russian messages on the destroyed buildings, and like some in English even. So I can't be accused of misinterpreting them. Those buildings were not destroyed by being made out of concrete, an inferior or somehow unworthy material. They were destroyed by what looks like artillery fire. Why are those included in the movie? Later buildings are shown being torn down by industrial equipment, but why did you include footage of Ukraine right at the start? I will also ask, why did you include a few minutes of footage in the middle of logging? Not like industrial logging, just a single tree being chopped down and dragged away. I thought maybe we were going to open up some dialogue about other building materials, like, say, wood, where when a wood building is destroyed, it will rot and become part of nature again, as a contrast to concrete that's just a dry, arid desert. Never brought up again. I don't know why the shot of a falling tree is there. Like all the rest of the movie, it looked pretty, but why is it there? Lastly, I'm sure the architect in the film understands some things about the history of concrete and the history of stone and all this stuff. I don't know that the filmmaker did, though. Why would you choose to show some characters in a explicitly Roman ruin, like one of the very few pieces of dialogue identifies that it was Roman, this Roman stone ruin? You know that the Romans built out of concrete too, right? And some of those Roman concrete buildings are still standing 2,000 years later? Buildings like the Pantheon in Rome? It's just such a weird decision to draw this direct comparison between modern concrete, old Roman stone. There were concrete Roman buildings too. You could have chosen other stone ruins. You could have chosen, I don't know, the Parthenon in Greece. Lots of Greek stone buildings. Parthenon's an interesting comparison too, as it was also partly destroyed by a war rather than by its material. But they didn't do that. So like I said, this is a topic I care about. It's why I watched the movie, and I was pretty disappointed that it sort of boiled down to a basic stone good, concrete bad message, and then extra disappointed by that message being directly stated instead of being left up to interpretation. It's just like, man, what are you doing? You have a lot of beautiful cinematography, and I think it was kind of wasted. So yeah, if this movie sounds really interesting to you, I mean, go see it yourself and form your own opinion, but it's a very self-selected crowd that will see a movie like this. And because it got good reviews from that self-selected crowd of people who actually cared to see it, I had pretty high hopes for this, but it just didn't meet my expectations, I guess. My expectations were too high for an art movie that explicitly advertises itself as being about stone and concrete. That's all. Thanks for watching, or really just listening. Not much visuals here to pick apart parts of it. I saw this in a theater 2 days ago. If you found this interesting, make sure to subscribe and then be disappointed when I don't make another movie review for another year or something.